Well, thank you, Chad, for leading our worship this morning. Just to let everybody know, Scott Young, our normal worship minister, is in Vienna, Austria right now. There's a missionary retreat over in Europe, and he is over there helping them with their retreat and leading worship, or at least I guess that's what they're calling it these days, missionary retreat. So you can kind of think whatever you want to on that. But we're thankful that you're here, Chad, to help us out. It's great to be part of a church family with so many talented people. If you're a guest with us this morning, I want to just tell you how thankful that I am that you're here this morning. Two things that I want to tell you. One, if you don't know a lot about this church family and you're just kind of wanting to know a little bit more, we've got an event called First Cup. Happens every week, and there's usually pretty much every week we have people that come and ask questions. It's right through these doors after this service. Turn right and find a room called the Parlor, and it's a good time where you can just ask questions that you would want to ask about this church family. I also want to tell you that this year we're going through something called the story, and we're trying in 31 weeks to get a big picture of what God is doing in the Bible, and then in turn what God's doing in our lives. And we're using a resource called the story, which is just an excerpt of Bible passages that help us understand what God's doing in the big story. And if you're a guest, we've got a copy of this for you for free, and we want you to pick it up at Information Central, which is just out the doors right behind the balcony, and we want you to pick up your copy before you leave church this morning. Well, do you ever wonder why, when you were in middle school, that you dressed the way that you did? I have nothing against middle schoolers. I love middle schoolers. The first 2 years of my career, I was a middle school youth minister, and yet when I look back on pictures of myself in that general time period, I just scratch my head and I think, what was I thinking? So just to get us in our head real quick, here's some pictures of our staff members. Generally, some of this is a little earlier than middle school, but just go ahead and put this first one up here. Anybody even know who that is? Who would you guess? This is Travis Akins, and he will be preaching in that vest next time he preaches. I mean, wow, like who would wear that, okay? Next one, you know who that is? That's Scott Young. He emailed me that picture, and then like a few days later, he sent me a second email saying, by the way, Phil, there's no undershirt in that picture. That's my skin. I was like, okay. I was like, thank you. Like, what? Don't need to tell me that. Okay, there's Scott. This next one is obviously me. I went through a phase of my life. I look back on that, I don't know what I was thinking. No idea what I was thinking. And then this last one is my favorite. Guess who that is? Andy Lashley, right there. He will be performing that same dance at the end of our service today. Now, why do you think it is that when you look back on pictures of yourself, we dress just ridiculous? Like we think back and like, what was I thinking? I'll tell you why I did it and why I'm guessing you did it. When you're growing up, especially in middle school and high school, you really, really care what other people are wearing, and you want to be like them. And what's interesting about younger people is that the way in which they covet other people's appearance, it's very visible. So the younger you are, the more visible it is, but the older you are, I think the more destructive it is. You see, just because we're not in middle school or we're not in high school anymore doesn't mean that we really, really want to be like the people around us. You see, I don't know everything about you, but one thing that I'm just going to make a guess here because it's true in my life. I'm going to guess that the thing that you want the most is within your sight, like you can see it, but it's out of your reach. You see, I think that the things we want the most are within our sight. I can see it, but they're out of our reach. Like I just can't get my arms around it. Like I think back, when I was in middle school, I didn't really care. I didn't covet, let's just say, my principal's salary. Because that was so far out of my mind, it was so far out of my sight, it wasn't close enough for me to want it. Now, if you showed me my classmates' shoes that were really cool, I would want those because those are more in my sight. And so the things that you want the most in your life are the things that are within your sight, but they're out of your reach. My kids help me understand this. If there's a toy and it's in the toy box, nobody cares about it, nobody wants it, it's out of sight. But the minute that toy comes out of the toy box, whether it's a doll, whether it's a ball, whatever it is, the minute the toy comes out of the toy box and one of my two girls is holding it, the other girl immediately wants it. You see, we want things that are within our sight, but they're out of our reach. Like, you know this in your life. Like, think about that. I'm just throwing out random examples here, but think about that time maybe you pull up at work and you park in the same spot every day, and your coworker also parks right next to you every day, and one day your coworker shows up in this brand new 2015 Lexus, and you look at it and you think, what a bummer. Like, you want that. Now it's in your sight and it's out of your reach, and so you want it. Maybe you see a married couple and they're close to your age, and you see them at a restaurant somewhere in town, and they're laughing, they're having a good time, and you look at that marriage and you think, we don't really have that anymore. And because that's in your sight now, you want it. You see, we want things that are within our sight, but they are out of our reach. And the problem comes in, let's say that in your life, you really want something. And let's just say it's somewhere on this playing field, like this grassy little turf area here, and you really, really want it. Like, let's say it's a relationship. And you pray about it, and you work really hard, and then finally you get this great relationship. It's either a friendship, almost tripped there. It's either a friendship, or it's a girlfriend, a boyfriend, husband, wife, and you finally get what you wanted. Well, guess what happens when you get what you want? When you get what you want, you are then able to see something else that you don't have. And so every time you get something that you thought that you wanted, it's great for a moment, but then it puts you in position to see something that you couldn't see before. And so if I get up here, this is great, I'll be happy for a while, but then eventually I'm going to walk over here, and I'm going to realize, wow, there's more grass. And you're going to want that over there. You see, they always say the grass is greener on the other side. Nobody ever says that the grass is greener across the state. You see, they say the grass is greener on the other side because you always want the thing that's right next to you. And so the problem becomes, this never stops. Like, if we could keep building this staircase, the greener grass would just go on and on and on and on forever. And yet the challenge for us as Christ followers is we find ourselves on one plane of grass, and we're supposed to be content. We're supposed to live life knowing that we'll never, ever get high enough on these grass levels. And how do you do that? Like, how do you live your life not always craving something that you don't have? You see, in the middle of the story that we're reading with Israel, Israel finds itself in a very unique situation in which they want something that's within their sight, but it's out of their reach. It has to do with the events that lead up to the crowning of Saul. And so just to speed you up, if you haven't been with us, basically what's been going on in the story, God creates the world, sin distorts the world, God raises up a people to reverse the sin problem, starts it with Abraham. Abraham raises this people, God gets them out of gets them out of Egypt with the Exodus, leads them through the wilderness with Joshua, gets them through the time of the judges, and these people find themselves at a very interesting place. The people of Israel have more in this season of their life than they've ever had. The people said, we want freedom. God said, I'll give you freedom. People said, well, we want land. God said, okay, I'll give you land. People said, well, we want a law. God said, okay, I'll give you the 10 Commandments. I'll give you a code. People said, well, we want leaders. God said, I'll give you leaders. So they've got more than they've ever had. They have it. And they're completely dissatisfied. Completely dissatisfied. And so that speeds us up to what's going on with Samuel and Saul. All the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. This is in Samuel chapter 8. They said to him, you are old, which is a terrible line to start off with anybody. They said to him, you are old and your sons don't follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us. Now that sounds like a reasonable request, but the next verse says, when they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. Now why would that displease Samuel? What's the big deal with having a king? David was the king, and he was the man after God's own heart. He was the king when Israel was in the glory days, which we'll talk about next week. So why does this displease Samuel? It's actually a very odd question to think about, because previously in the Bible has prophesied about the day in which God will give Israel a king. For example, Genesis chapter 17. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. God said that. Go to Deuteronomy 17. Be sure to, or when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, be sure to appoint over you a king that the Lord your God chooses. And so twice in Scripture, God has already said, by the way, in the future, I'm going to give you a king. And we get to this point in 1 Samuel where the people say, okay, God, we're ready, give us our king, and God's not pleased with this. So why in the world would God say, yes, you can have a king, and then also say, no, I'm not really pleased with your request. Well, here's why. Look at verse 5. People say this, appoint a king to lead us as all the other nations have. You see, the problem was not with the request itself. The problem was with the motivation behind the request. Happens again in verse 20. The people say this, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and to fight our battles. So God doesn't have a problem with what they're asking. He has a problem with why they are asking it. They want a king so that they can be like all the other nations around them. Because when they look out at all these other nations and when the other nations go to battle, guess who's leading them? They've got this physical human being with a crown on their head leading them in the battle, and they want to be like those people. And so that's why they ask this. So in other words, Israel has something that's, again, it's in their sight. They can see that other nations have kings, but it's out of their reach. And so they desperately want it. So here's what God does in response to their request. First thing he does is he warns them. He says this in verse 12, 13, 14. It's kind of a summary here. But God says this in warning. He says, okay, you want a king? This is what a king who will reign over you will do. He'll take your sons. He'll take your daughters. He'll take the best of your fields. He'll take 1/10 of your flocks. And you yourselves will become his slaves. And so he warns the people saying, I know you want a king, but do you realize what's actually going to happen if you get a king? He's going to take all the best of your stuff, and you're going to end up being his slaves. And I think, kind of switching back to your world, I do think that when you consider the thing you want the most, that thing that you want more than anything that's within your sight but out of your reach, I do think that if you really pay attention to the Bible and you pay attention to your prayer life, I think that you can discern what the Lord would say in warning concerning the thing that you want the most. That's what he does to Israel. I'll warn you, but here's the second thing he does. He doesn't force them. He warns them saying this is what a king's going to do, but God does not force them not to have a king. And this is very consistent with the nature of God. God will always tell you what you should do. He'll tell you what you should know, but he will never force you to choose the right way. So God does not force the people's hand. You see, here's what one principle that you find about God in the Bible. In the big picture of God's story, his sovereignty controls everything. God is the one in charge of the story. He's in charge of the beginning. He's in charge of the end. And in his sovereignty, he's going to make sure that happens. But in the lower story, in the smaller story of your life and my life, what God does is he displays an infinite amount of flexibility to work within our own decisions. And what he can do is he can actually work within our sinful choices. And so that's what's about to happen with the next part of this story. So the people come in. They say, Samuel, we want a king. We want to be like those other nations. God, through Samuel, says, you don't really want a king because this is what a king's going to do to you. And then the people say, whatever, give us a king. We don't care. We want the king. And so then the story kind of speeds along to chapter 12. And chapter 12 is like the inauguration. Like this is the day when Saul, who at first is hiding behind the boxes, there's a painting of Saul over there. Saul is going to be made king. And so this is the big inauguration day. If you're a Frozen fan, this is coronation day. And Saul's coming out, and he's about to be crowned king over everybody. And Samuel, he gets up and delivers what I think is maybe the single most unappreciated speech in the entire Bible. It's an unbelievable speech. Samuel gets up. Before they anoint Saul, Samuel says, now then, stand here, because I am going to confront you with evidence before the Lord as to all the righteous acts performed by the Lord for you and your ancestors. So Samuel gets up, the people are before him, and he says basically, you're about to get what you think that you want, but before you get what you want, let me tell you what God has already done. Let me tell you about your past. And Samuel starts into this speech, and he goes through the Exodus, and he says, remember that it was your God who brought you out of slavery in Egypt. And then he starts going through the Judges, and he basically says, remember, this is your God who delivered you from the hand of all these enemies around you. This is your God. And so Samuel's reminding them, this is what God has done for you. He's given you freedom. He's given you leaders. He's given you a law. He's given you deliverance. God has done all these things for you. And then Samuel cuts to the heart of the speech, which is the main point of this whole section of Scripture. Samuel says this, "You said to me, 'We want a king to rule over us,' even though the Lord your God was your king." You see, Samuel cuts to the heart of what's really going on here. The people so desperately want a king, and Samuel looks straight at him and says, "You've already got a king, and his name is Yahweh." You see, the main thing that Samuel wants to tell to the people is the same thing that I think God wants to tell us, and that's this: you already have what you think that you want. You've already got what you think that you want. You see, with Israel, Samuel's looking at them thinking, you want a king to lead you in battle? Okay, who was it that brought you out of Egypt? Who was it that took down Jericho? Who was it that defeated the Midianites? You've already got a king. You think you want this king, but let me tell you, Israel, you already have what you think that you want, and the same is true for your life and my life. We already have what we think in our minds that we want. And so what happens with us is we get on whatever playing field we're on, whatever level of grass you're on, and you're standing here, and for a while you're happy with it, whether it's you've elevated yourself to some economic status, or you have some new social status, or you have some new toy in your life, and you get really, really happy about it, but then pretty soon you start reaching. And you reach out for that next thing that's within your sight, but it's out of your reach. And what God is trying to say to us is, let's say, for example, that you're in this season of life and you really, really want that bonus at the end of the year. And you're saying, God, if you'll just give me that bonus, then my life will be content and I'll have security. And God is saying to us, He's saying, I can give you the bonus, but I'm your security. You already have what you think that you want. Or maybe you're in that season of life where you're like, I'm just so busy. I wish I had rest. I wish I had vacation. You're just praying, God, can you just free up my schedule? I want vacations like all my other friends have. Maybe God would be saying to you, I can give you that, but guess what? I'm your rest. I'm your source of deep rest. You've already got what you think you want. Or maybe it is a relationship. You want that relationship so badly, and you're desperately reaching out for it, and God is saying, I can give you that, but you've got to understand that your sense of belonging won't come from that person. Your sense of belonging comes from me. You see, over and over and over again, what God says is, you've already got what you think that you want. And so what we find is we're all standing at some point in life. We've got a past. We've come from somewhere. We've got a future. We're going somewhere, and it's so tempting to believe that the grass is always going to be greener on the other side. You can come to church and believe this. Some of you come to church and you get so insecure because you look at everybody else, and everybody seems to have a perfect family. They seem to have nicer clothes than you do. They seem to be happier than you do. And you come to this place and you think, I don't really fit in because every single person just seems to be happier than I am. But you have to understand that the grass is not greener on the other side. The grass is actually greener where you water it. The point, you're at a place right now. And that's the point right now where you need to find the presence of God. It's not over there, because if you get to that platform, you're going to feel the exact same way. The grass is not greener on the other side. The grass is actually greener exactly where you water it. And so what happens is, if you spend the rest of your life obsessed with the bonus that you didn't get, and fretting about the unblemished face that you don't have, and fretting about the house that you don't have, and fretting that your house isn't as clean as you wanted, if you spend the rest of your life doing those things, then you're going to miss the blessings of God right where you are. The only place where you can find contentment is right where you are. You see, here's the thing about contentment. We like to believe that contentment comes from climbing the ladder. Contentment does not come from climbing. Contentment comes from claiming the lordship of Jesus right where you are. And I would say to you, this is just my opinion, I would say to you that I like technology and everything, but one area of life that robs us of contentment, I truly believe, is social media. You think about Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, what's really going on there? You're comparing someone else's highlight reel to your lowlight reel. You're comparing their best to your worst, and every time you look at it, you have the same feeling. I want that, the thing that's out of my sight, but it's within my reach. It breeds discontentment. But you got to understand, real contentment does not come from climbing, because the ladder never stops. Real contentment comes from claiming the lordship of Jesus in your life right now. So here's what Samuel does next in his speech. He lets them have it. He says, you've already got a king, and you've already got what you think that you want. And then he gets to this section where he tells them what they need to do to live in the blessing of God. It's really interesting. Verse 13, Samuel says, here's your king you've chosen, the one you've asked for. See, the Lord's given you a king. And then in verse 14, he lets them know what to do in order to live in the blessing of God. So here's what he says. He says, if you fear the Lord, and if you serve him and obey him, good. That's where you find the goodness of God. But if you don't obey the Lord, his hand's going to be against you. In other words, what Samuel is saying is, he's saying, here's your king, and whoop-de-doo. It doesn't matter that you have a king. If you want to receive the blessing of God in your life, then you've got to do the same thing that you were supposed to do the last 1,000 years. It hadn't changed since it was Abraham and the nomads, hadn't changed since it was Moses and the slaves, hadn't changed since it was Joshua and the wanderers. If you want the blessings of God in your life, it does not come from having a king on the throne. It comes through faithfulness to the lordship of God. And the same is true for your life. If you're wanting the blessing of God in your life, it has nothing to do with the thing that you think that you want. Living in the blessing of God has everything to do with faithfulness. And so if we spend our lives climbing, we're never going to be content. We only find the satisfaction of Jesus Christ when we stay in one spot and we claim the lordship of Jesus in our circumstance now, regardless of what that means in the future. Right now, how do you claim the lordship of Jesus? We had a story recently about Billy Graham. And years ago, he took a trip to the Caribbean islands, and he was on one particular island, and he was pretty famous at this point in his career. He's obviously still famous today, but he had lunch with one of the most wealthy people in the world. This was a multi-billionaire. This guy had several jets, several houses throughout the world, and so Billy Graham has lunch with this super, super wealthy guy. Well, in the middle of lunch, Billy Graham looks over at this guy, and the guy's eyes are just filling with tears. And the guy starts crying over lunch. And Dr. Graham says, can you tell me what's wrong? And the guy says this. He looks at Dr. Graham and says, I am the most miserable man in the world. Out there is my yacht. I can go anywhere I want to. I've got a private plane. I've got my helicopter. I have everything I want to make my life happy, and yet I am as miserable as hell. Same day, Billy Graham leaves lunch with this man who's so miserable, and he meets a local church minister. It's an Englishman, very, very poor minister, and he has a conversation with this guy, and this guy tells him that he spends most of his days taking care of his two invalid sisters. Sisters are really sick, and so most of the day this guy spends running errands for them. He spends feeding them. He spends going out and just doing things that they need done, that he's just a caretaker. And as Dr. Graham started talking to this guy, in the middle of the conversation, this guy looked at Dr. Graham, and remember, he's an Englishman, so they have pounds, not dollars, and he said, Dr. Graham, I don't have 2 pounds to my name, but I'm the happiest man on this island. You see, the poor minister had what the wealthiest guy in the world thought that he wanted. He had the Lord. You see, when you spend your whole life trying to climb the ladder, you will find that the ladder never stops. So here's what I would like you to do right now. On the left side of your pew, there's little cards, and they're little yellow cards. I want you to pass them down the pew. Hopefully everybody can grab one. There's a crown on one side which says, I want, and then at the bottom it says, it is in my sight and out of my reach. And then on the back it has kind of the main idea of this sermon. And here's what I want you to do with the side where there's a crown which says, I want, ... I want you to take just a few seconds and I want you to really think about what's the one thing that you want in life right now that's within your sight, but it's out of your reach. And I'd like you to actually write that word down on the piece of paper, because we're about to do something with the paper, and I'd like everybody, if you have a pen, I'd like you to write a word down. So I'm going to give you just a few seconds to think about what that word might be. The thing that's in your sight, but it's out of your reach. Okay, once you have your word written down, and you can finish up if you can, we're gonna try something we've never done exactly this way. We'll see if we can. I think we can do this. It's not that hard. But what I want you to do is I want you to, first of all, turn it over so it has the I already have part. And I want us to read this phrase together. So read it with me. I already have what I think that I want. And then this great verse from Paul, I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. What I want you to do is I want you to turn it face down, and I want you to pass it to the right side of the pew. Just pass them all down. When you pass them down, if you're on the aisle and you get a stack of these cards, then you have a special job here. I want you to take your stack, once it gets to you, and I want you to exchange it with someone from a different aisle. And I hope you didn't sign your name on the cards. I forgot to say that. Don't sign your name. Sorry about that. So take your stack and exchange it with some aisle close to you. It can be across the aisle, behind you. Just, you can figure it out. If everybody has already traded, I guess you don't have to trade, but try to trade with somebody. I'll give you a second to do that. Okay, now as you're trading, I'll explain what we're doing here. When the new aisle person gets the cards, I want you to redistribute them to your aisle. And so what I'm wanting most of us to hold in our hands someone else's card without their name on it. And the idea is, what I would like you to do this week is, I don't want to give you something that you're not going to be able to do, but for 1 week, for 7 days, what I'm asking you to do, and I'll participate in this too, I want you to pray on behalf of someone else, that God will give them the courage to let go of that thing that they want so badly and accept and claim the lordship of Jesus in their life, and then somewhere in that to find contentment. So I'm wanting you to pray a prayer of contentment for somebody else in the congregation. Now, some of you, just the way it's going to work, you're not going to get a card. So I would say if you have multiple cards, bring them up to the stage afterwards, and if you didn't get a card, you can come get a card. And so my idea is, let's lift up ourselves in prayer. Let's lift up the church in prayer so that all of us can maybe take one step closer to being content this week in the Lord. So pray for someone this week. Here's how we're going to end. Samuel ends his speech with what I think is the greatest ending to any speech in the Bible. After he gives his history lesson and after he calls them out for already having a king, he ends with an object lesson, which is a lot cooler than grass and stairs. Here's what he says. I will call on the Lord to send thunder and rain, and you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king. Then Samuel called on the Lord, and that same day the Lord sent thunder and rain, so all the people stood in awe of the Lord and of Samuel. You see, Samuel ends his speech by saying, you think you really want a king? Let me show you who the real king is. And you can just imagine in your own minds as lightning fills up the sky and the people stand before the Lord and they realize, wow, he really is the king. This is like a dream lesson of mine. I wish I could stand outside someday and say, Lord, now! And that it would just happen, but it's probably not going to happen. But it's an amazing ending to this speech. Basically what he's saying is, sure, God's going to give you what you want, but right now I want you to stand in awe of the real king, because the real king doesn't sit on the throne on the earth. The real king sits on the throne of heaven, and that's the one that's supposed to earn and deserves our worship. And so the people just end this amazing speech worshiping the King of Kings. And so that's what I want to do this morning. We're going to sing one or two more songs. I would ask you to stand. We're about to sing just like these Israelites did. And I would ask you as you stand to just think through a couple things. One thing is, we're going to sing the song, I Stand in Awe of You. And I would encourage you to really worship. Sometimes we come to church and we forget that the reason we're here is to partake of the blood of Jesus and then to honor God with our praise. Sometimes we get so distracted with our lunch plans and what we have to teach. And for those of you that serve in ministries in the church, you get so distracted with that. Let's worship God, just like the Israelites did. And so I would encourage you to just think about the King of Kings as we sing this song. And I would also say there's some of you that God is convicting you of things going on in your heart. Like you've got heart work going on today. You've been confronted with your lack of trust, your lack of contentment, your lack of gratitude. And maybe today is the day when you need to reclaim lordship. You need to reclaim lordship of Jesus and stop trying to climb the ladder. If you want to reclaim the lordship of Jesus through repentance, then come forward. If you want to reclaim the lordship of Jesus through prayer, come find me. If you want to reclaim the lordship of Jesus through baptism, come on down. We'll celebrate your new birthday. And if you're not going to do those things, I encourage you to stand right where you are and to look to the heavens